Outs from nearly 300 people. So we'll be relying primarily on the chat box today for our interactions, but we're also considering ways to increase the methods of interaction for our future sessions. We're also hoping that you'll be able to utilize the time in between this session and the next to be able to touch base with your team and review any questions you might have. We'll be collecting questions that come up throughout each session in a frequently asked questions document that will be sent out as a reference to everyone at the end of the series. And you can also feel free to email either me or my colleague Heidi, who you'll meet here in a moment, with additional questions. We'll be recording today's session for anyone who isn't able to attend. I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. If you could please make sure to keep your video turned off if possible, just to allow bandwidth for everyone to participate. And also if you could make sure that you stay on mute. We'd really appreciate that. Thank you. Let's go ahead and get started. So knowing that we have limited time in each of these 90-minute sessions, we wanted to provide you some background information ahead of time in our introductory video, which was accessible to you within the reminder email that you received when registering. I know several of you registered just within the last day or so. So if you weren't able to watch the video ahead of time, no worries. It's also accessible on our website, which we'll be showing you momentarily. We will just briefly review the contents of the video now in order to make sure everyone's prepared to engage as fully as possible in our first session. But if you have questions, please feel free to ask them using the chat box. And don't forget, you can review the intro video before our next session as well. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to introduce myself and then turn it over to my colleague Heidi. So my name is Ashley Quick. I've been with Public Consulting Group and Project Success for 3 years now. Before that, I was a special education teacher for 10 years. And in between, I took what I call a gap year or 2 or 3, doing some project management work with a textbook publisher. The Project Success team enjoys showing off our families during our presentation. So this is a picture from our quarantine times here, the Front Porch Project. This is my husband, Tony, and our twins, Aaliyah and Jackson.
Good morning. My name is Heidi Brett Baker, and I am part of the Project Success team as well. I've been with PCG for 2 years now. I've had a lot of roles in my 33 years as an educator. I taught for many years, and then I became a school administrator, working as a principal and a director of special ed and district-wide student service specialist. I also have taught in higher ed and done some transition programs for students with intellectual disabilities in the higher ed arena. I'm really happy to be here today, and we're excited that you're joining us for this series. We also like to share with you all the other on our team who are here on this virtual series as well. We have Meredith Katie Burke. She is our director of our Project Success project. We have Amy Howie, who is our advisor for our Project Success team. And then we have Mary Baker Badista. She is our project manager and project specialist. And then we have Christine Krieger, who is our project manager for the project. They're all on this session with us, and they will be monitoring the chat box and kind of helping us with technical difficulties. Hopefully we won't have any, but they will be helping us with that. So if you have questions or you have anything to share, please add it to the chat box and they will alert us to that as Ashley and I are presenting. So like Ashley spoke about just a minute ago, we are hopeful that many of you who received the pre-activities ahead of time, we also included a intro video because we wanted to have enough time in our 90-minute sessions to really accomplish the content, the meat of what we're talking about for inclusive practice. But yet we want to share with you a couple of things about us and about who we are in our state. So I'm going to briefly go over the next 5 slides. If you want to know more detail about them, you certainly can go through that intro video again, or if you haven't had yet to do it, I would encourage you to be able to view it after this session. So Project Success is a statewide resource center that is funded by the Indiana Department of Education to support educators of students with significant disabilities. We provide professional development at no cost across a wide variety of topics and in a different variety of formats, which you can be seen here. More information, like I told you, is available on the video. We also wanted to give you a side note here that often throughout this presentation, you are going to hear us say intellectual disabilities or cognitive disabilities. Those two terms are interchangeable based upon different laws and different terms. People use it interchangeably, and we just wanted to make sure that you knew that we are using it interchangeably. Also, we wanted to let you know that today we are really looking through the lens of, as an educator with supporting students with intellectual disabilities, but all the content that we will present today is definitely applicable to any student with disabilities and the inclusion of all students with disabilities. So we are fortunate in Indiana to belong to the Indiana Resource Network. This is a large group of resource centers that each have their own specialty area in Indiana. They are either partially or fully funded by the Indiana Department of Education. For more information about what their supports are and what their services are, you can click right on the links on this slide and it would open up to their website, or you could simply go into the Indiana Department of Education website and on the search bar type in IRN, and this would, a list of our resource centers would pull up and you could get a description of them as well as link to their website so you can know more about them. Our website is www.projectsuccessindiana.com. It's important to pay attention to that Indiana part specifically, because when you're Googling, if you don't include the Indiana, you might, there are several other Project Success websites that you might come across. But when you do, and you log up to our homepage, you could click on resources in this upper right-hand corner, and you'd be able to access all the guidance documents that we're talking about today, templates, our recorded webinars, and other information. There's a wealth of resources on our website. So when you do click on that resources, if you go to the regional trainings and you select the Summer Institute 2020 and select Go, you would be able to find all the resources that we're talking about today on our website. So throughout our sessions for the next 3 sessions and today, we will be referring back to the Inclusive Practice Engagement Guide. Whenever you see this icon on the right with the stars and the green and the blue check mark, that means that this slide has access to something in our engagement guide. So it will be maybe a question, a prompt, or some resource that's located in our engagement guide. So it'd be helpful at this time, if you have it, to get that engagement guide out and keep that next to you, as well as our Inclusive Practice Framework document, because we'll be referring to those often throughout the presentation today and our other 2 presentations. So let's talk about our agenda for today. So these are the things that we hope to accomplish today. We've already shared our introductions, and we'll be reviewing the training series and session 1 pre-activities in just a moment. We'll be looking at the Inclusive Practice Framework overall, and then breaking it down to examine each step so that we're familiar with the content and what it takes to really think about each step of the Inclusive Practice Framework. Today, we're going to start by really thinking about establishing the need for change when it comes to implementing or expanding the use of inclusive practices, as well as gathering an inclusive team and creating an inclusive vision for moving forward. We'll then wrap it up by previewing what's ahead for session 2. So for today, our objectives that we'd like to accomplish would be that you'll be able to understand and establish the need for change in approaching inclusive practices, be able to identify critical members of an inclusive team, and be able to recognize the process for creating an inclusive vision. Hopefully, like we talked about a little bit ago, that you've received the session 1 pre-activities when we sent out the link for today's WebEx. We certainly know that some of you, like Ashley said a little bit ago, just joined today, yesterday, or signed up yesterday, so you might not have had enough time to do all the pre-activities. We certainly hope that you'd go back and be able to complete these after today, before our next session. They will be very helpful resources when you're thinking about inclusive practices, and they'll really help you set the framework and give you knowledge, and also gives you great tools to use when you are thinking about inclusive practice. So we'd encourage you to go back and do those. So here's our first question that we'd like for you to answer in the chat. We really encourage you to participate in our chat box today. And also remember, at that bottom right-hand side, you see the icon for engagement guide. So in your engagement guide, this question is in there, and you could jot down some answers, or you could just think them through. So thinking back to the information and the framework, or the document that we've shared, or the video, the articles, or when you were completing the self-assessment, share with us some answers to these two questions. How much of the information shared in the pre-activities felt familiar to you, or aligned to your beliefs? And what was surprising or stood out to you? Somebody said they really liked the pictorial timeline. Good point. Somebody said they need to do more inclusion instead of integration. Somebody said the basics of inclusion are certainly familiar, but all the content is new. Loving the toolbox. There's a wealth of information in that toolbox. If you haven't looked at it, I would encourage you to do that. Somebody talked about Shelley Moore. She's somebody's hero. People definitely need some more inclusion and interaction with gen ed teachers. A couple people said that it definitely wasn't new information, but how they're processing it, how they're going to share that with others in the school. They're going to be thinking about that. The self-assessment was revealing and helpful. I'm glad the self-assessment was helpful. I would encourage you all to do that if you've not done it, to really think about, like this another person said, that where the gaps are. I like the idea that when we're stuck, we can go back to the framework to see what step we might have missed. I want to include my entire leadership to do this again with me, somebody said. Love the organization of the toolbox. So the toolbox seems to be a great resource for everybody. So if you've not had a chance to look at that, I would encourage you to go back and do that. Somebody said there's a need to increase the role of the related services in this process. I would agree. Definitely. Definitely need to include all educators. You are correct. All right. Self-assessment was informative. So please take a moment, if you didn't get a chance to do that ahead of time, to fill that out before our next session. All right, we are going to move on. Thank you for sharing. We really encourage you, when you see a slide like this, that we want you to share in the chat box, and to really give us your thoughts and any questions you have. We'll be glad to try try to answer those. And if not, like Ashley said, whenever questions that arise, we will put out a guide for questions and answers.
All right, thanks, Heidi. So let's really dig in now to this idea of inclusive practices. It's important to remember that the act of inclusion is intentional. It requires us to identify and remove barriers within our classrooms and schools so that each and every student can participate to the best of their ability. It doesn't happen by accident. If you're wondering how to know which students quote unquote qualify for inclusive practices, this flowchart on the right will be a helpful reference for you. So if you watch the video on the evolution of inclusion that was part of the pre-activities, you'll recognize this graphic, or at least most of it. It's been updated since that video was released. I just want you to think through here for a moment what you notice about the movement of the colors of these dots and where the colors are in relation to the larger circle. They're gradually becoming more a part of the bigger circle as you move from left to right. I want you to think about who's benefiting from the movement of these dots. Think about the challenges that these dots moving from being outside the larger circle to brought together outside the larger circle to inside the larger circle, but still together, to sprinkled in, you know, amongst the larger circle, to then everyone's their own color. Think about the challenges that that movement has presented for both students and educators. How is equity for students with disabilities increasing as those dots are moving? What are the benefits of that last one, inclusion in reality? How do all learners benefit from that model? There's a lot going on here, right? So this is both the evolution of inclusion across time, across years, as we have implemented legislation that has brought about the need for free and appropriate public education and all of that. But it's also perhaps a microcosm of where your classroom, your school, your district could be in terms of where they are with inclusion. Many times we find that schools or districts, they are integrating and they call that inclusion, but we see that there's still some movement and some ways to go to really get to inclusion in reality. We'll return back to this idea throughout the training series and in follow-up sessions as well. But I think it's important to really, you know, it's such a simple graphic, but it really, there's a lot going on in there. So those questions that I posed, we'll include those in the follow-up to this session. That would be a great thing to think through in a little more detail. So basically, to summarize it, you know, education has moved from excluding students with disabilities completely to bringing them together in a segregated setting, then to integrating them within the gen ed setting, and then this is where we oftentimes get stuck. So today's session and our future sessions are really meant to help you get out of that bubble of being stuck in integration and move to the inclusion. True inclusion recognizes the vast diversity among each and every student regarding the presence of a disability, but also other forms of diversity as well, including gender, race, socioeconomic status, family background, etc. So it's easy, I think, to agree with inclusion as an idea, but what does it really mean for us as educators? Inclusion of students with disabilities, even students with the most significant disabilities, means that students participate as full members of age-appropriate general education classrooms. They're not special visitors. Regardless of how much time they physically spend in that classroom, the setup should reflect full recognition of that student as a member of the class. They should have a desk, a cubby, a spot for their work to hang on the wall, a class job that's posted on the board. You know, whatever it is that other students have, that student with a disability should have too. Inclusion means that learning is individualized and differentiated for all students based on their unique abilities and strengths. The presence of a student with a disability does not decrease what is available to the other students in the room. Gen ed teachers and special ed teachers work together to support all students in a way that is cooperative and collaborative. And as a school community, there's an emphasis on team planning and problem solving with regard to all students. No one teacher is expected to do everything when it comes to meeting the needs of students. And there's no my students versus your students. It's all students are our students. So in case we needed that a little more clear, we want to do what's on the left and we want to stay away from what's on the right. So this quote, I think, does a nice job of summarizing this introductory sort of discussion on inclusion in general. When inclusive education is fully embraced, we abandon the idea that children have to become normal, quote unquote, in order to contribute to the world. We begin to look beyond typical ways of becoming valued members of the community, and in doing so, begin to realize the achievable goal of providing all children with an authentic sense of belonging. Inclusion is an approach, it's not a program. It's an attitude, it's not an activity or a location. Inclusion truly is belonging for students. So how do we do it? Whether you've been implementing inclusive practices in your classroom or school for years, or you're just getting started, this framework will guide you through the process in a structured, step-by-step way. As we mentioned earlier, this framework is what our training series is based off of, and we'll be breaking down elements throughout the 3 weeks in order to examine what you can do to bring each one to your classroom, your school, or your district. It starts with establishing the need for change, and once that need's been established, you'll want to gather a group of people who are committed to this journey and really work together to create a vision for where you want to go. And those are the elements that we'll be discussing today. Once you've developed your inclusive vision, you'll need to share it with others to bring them alongside you, and then it's time to take action. Implementing inclusive practices requires very much of a start small, think big mentality. It's easy to get overwhelmed with all the things that need to get done or be changed in order for inclusion to be successful. So that's why it's important to stop and recognize the small wins along the way. Small wins add up to big changes in the long run. And at some point, though, you'll want to take time to reflect on the actions you've taken so far and the impact they've had on inclusion of students with disabilities. Taking stock of what's gone well, what hasn't gone well, and what hasn't happened at all, and then comparing those results to your inclusive vision statement will give you new information to consider moving forward. You'll need to make some adjustments and try again. That's part of the process. And eventually, the more small wins you build up, the more it becomes the norm in your classroom, your building, or your district. And then it kind of starts all over again. It's a cycle. So you'll see throughout these 3 weeks and beyond that we'll move through this framework and explain each step in greater detail. Let's dig in just a little more closely now to that first step of establishing the need for change. It's a critical first step because if there's not a belief that something needs to change with regard to inclusive practices, then nothing will change. Let's look at some of the elements that influence this need for change. So there's a lot that goes into implementing inclusive practices. And if what we're currently doing is, quote unquote, working, right, where we feel okay about it, why should we feel like we need to be doing something different? So these elements here, legislation, research, mindset, and teamwork, these are the main drivers for implementing inclusive practices and increasing inclusion for students with disabilities. So let's look at legislation first, briefly. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it is important to recognize how legislation shapes what we're called to do as educators. Inclusion of students with disabilities in general education, it's the law. It's simply the law according to these pieces that are listed here. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is the law that ensures a free and appropriate public education is available to students with disabilities throughout the United States. Article 7 is specific to Indiana, but within your own individual states, your state has special education rules as well that are adopted by the State Board of Ed in order to implement the requirements of IDEA. So how you follow those rules, that's a piece of the legislation as well. And then the Every Student Succeeds Act, that's sort of in conjunction with IDEA. This is what used to be known as the No Child Left Behind Act. That act, the Every Student Succeeds Act, has 3 stages that I think are really powerful when they're outlining a student's right to engage in gen ed if they have a disability. And those 3 stages are access, involvement, and progress. And we'll talk about each of those in a little more detail moving forward. The last piece of legislation, it's not exactly legislation, but legal guidance here, is the recent Supreme Court case at the federal level of Andrew versus Douglas, focusing on a pretty narrow point of law being how much benefit should special ed be providing to students with disabilities. And that case found that it needs to be more than the bare minimum, which for a long time had been the standard. As long as you're doing a little bit more than the bare minimum, you're good. But now we're really seeing and being pushed that we need to be doing more than the bare minimum for students with disabilities. And this quote from Chief Justice Roberts does a good job of summing that up. A student who's offered an educational program providing merely more than de minimis, which is the minimal, right, the bare minimum, progress from year to year can hardly be said to have been offered an education at all. So the sum total of this and all this other legislation, that really lays a solid foundation for the need for inclusion. So that's the first element. One more piece here to put kind of a pin in it. In order for a student to receive a free and appropriate public education as required by law, they must be involved in and making progress in the general education curriculum. So this applies even to students with the most significant disabilities, not just those students who look, quote unquote, like they're capable of it. Paula Kluth tells a story about someone seeing a successful person with a disability, and this person says, well, yeah, they're successful, but they're competent, like they were already competent, right? And so it sort of made it sound like there are other students out there with disabilities who aren't competent and then perhaps therefore don't deserve the access to gen ed. But think about that. How do you know, or how do you think that this particular individual became competent, right? They have to be given opportunities first. So for many students with disabilities, even and especially those with the most significant disabilities, opportunities come first and competence follows. So we can't let ourselves fall in the trap of looking on the surface at what a student is capable of and determining their competence and then providing opportunities accordingly. We need to have those opportunities come first. Final point on this topic, I promise. LRE, or least restrictive environment, is the provision within the IDEA law that mandates students with disabilities be educated to the maximum extent appropriate with their non-disabled peers. I know many of us are familiar with that phrase, to the maximum extent appropriate. So educating students with disabilities in separate settings, it's simply not equal. There will always be circumstances, of course, in which a student's health or safety may require services and supports beyond what can be provided in the gen ed setting, and that's understandable. But before students are placed in that more restrictive setting, the LRE mandate requires that an effort must be made to keep the student in a less restrictive setting. It all goes back to that idea of the maximum extent appropriate, not the maximum extent convenient for staff or anyone else. So in fact, actually research has suggested that the majority of practices observed in self-contained settings could be implemented in more inclusive settings without compromising the effectiveness of instruction. I think that's really powerful. And speaking of research, let's dig into that piece a little bit. So there are a few elements here that I want to go over. All of this from pretty recent research, and I cited it down there at the bottom if you're interested in learning more. Inclusive placements in general education classrooms for students with significant cognitive disabilities correlates positively with their achievement. So I know oftentimes teachers, educators are concerned that students won't have their needs met in the gen ed setting, but if we're doing inclusion correctly and putting in the effort and the work to do it correctly, research is showing that yes, those inclusive placements, they do meet the needs of these students and their achievement is correlated positively with that inclusion. Research has also found that when students with intellectual disabilities are educated with their non-disabled peers, they make progress on their social goals. That seems, pretty obvious, but it's an important consideration because students, especially those with significant intellectual disabilities, they're going to grow up to be adults with significant intellectual disabilities in a world that is not self-contained. So being an equal participant in what we would call a typical social environment is the best way for these students to observe and naturally learn those appropriate social interactions. Last point on this slide, when students without disabilities are educated in inclusive classrooms, they develop skills like empathy and advocacy, and there's no negative effect on their academic performance. This is a concern we hear over and over again from teachers and administrators. We know the pressure for students to achieve has never been higher. And teachers are understandably worried that the inclusion of students with disabilities will negatively impact the achievement of students without identified disabilities. Yes, having students with significant disabilities included in the classroom will cause things to be different, sometimes in a less than positive way. However, a few points. One, children are amazingly resilient, and what was once a novel or distracting element in the classroom, it'll quickly become ordinary and boring. And two, on a daily basis, it might certainly feel like the wheels are falling off or like you're not able to reach every student the way you'd like to. But the research supports that over the long term, from a broad perspective, student achievement is not impacted. I think that's a really critical piece to think through here. And then bringing it a little closer to home for those of us from Indiana, this is a study from Indiana University's Center on Education and Lifelong Learning through the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community. This study followed a cohort of Indiana students with disabilities from 3rd through 8th grade to assess the relationship between their academic success and their special education placement in either high, mixed, or low inclusive classrooms. And then by comparing those outcomes of students with disabilities who were included in gen ed to the outcomes of similar students who were placed in special ed separate classrooms, the study determined that the impact of inclusion on state assessments was positive, that the inclusion of students with disabilities in general education classrooms provided a significantly higher score on Indiana state assessments than students in the self-contained setting. And I think this quote here from the study co-author Sandy Colt does a really good job of summarizing that. So anyone who's struggling with making the right decision regarding inclusion, this study provides greater certainty that there is that strong relationship between having that inclusion and having that increased academic achievement. Okay, we're halfway through the considerations for establishing the need for change with regards to inclusive practice. But before we move on, I want to hear from you all how you think legislation and research impact what you do on a daily basis. So in the chat box, if you could give us a sense of how your work is affected by legislation and/or research by rating it on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being never even think about it, never enters my mind to think about the law or the research around these ideas, and 10 being it impacts every single thing I do. You'll see the engagement icon on this slide. That means these reflection questions are in your engagement guide as well, so you'll be able to think through them again in the future. Seeing a lot of fairly high numbers, mid to high numbers. Yeah. It's definitely, it lays the groundwork, right? Because if we didn't have the legislation, who knows what we would be doing, right? That's the sort of the starting point. We have to do what the law says, so that's where we're starting from. So that's kind of baked into what we already do. But in terms of it impacting your personal beliefs and then your actual actions that you take, that's where we might see a little more variance, right? When we start looking here at the next slide, well, here, let's just go ahead and look. So there's not a whole lot we can do about the legislation and the research. The legislation is there, the research is done, but and that is what is guiding us, right? And as I said earlier, sort of lays the groundwork for us. But where we do have a lot of impact, especially when we get down to the district level, the building level, the individual level, that's where we can have sort of real influence and real impact on mindset, especially. And this is kind of one of my big faves to talk about, is the mindset piece and how we can influence mindset when we're thinking about inclusive practices. So you may have seen this graphic before, or perhaps a similar graphic. This is the top half, and I'll show you the bottom half of the graphic here in a second. There are some in education who worry that doing different things for students with disabilities is somehow unfair to students without identified disabilities. But I think we need to let go of the idea that something isn't quote unquote fair just because it's different from what other people have or are doing. And I found this graphic to really do a good job of breaking this down by comparing education and medicine. So you're considering on the left, this group of children, they go to the doctor with really a variety of medical needs, a scraped knee, a broken arm, a cough, and the doctor is prescribing the same treatment, cough medicine, to all of them. This approach is certainly equal, but it means only one student actually gets what they need. And of course, that's not fair. Here's the bottom half of that graphic. It's the same concept when we think about the expectations that we have for students with disabilities, especially those with more significant disabilities. In this case, fair wouldn't mean that students with and without identified disabilities receive the same instruction, services, or supports. Fair would mean that each student gets what they need in order to be successful. So the point isn't necessarily for a student with a disability, especially a significant intellectual disability, it's not that we want them to be doing the same volume of work or the same complexity of work as a student without identified disabilities. The point is for that student to have equal access to the same content. Since you all have joined us to learn more about inclusive practices, I'm pretty sure this is an idea that you're probably already on board with. But if you need an easy way to share that idea, that view with others, you might consider using this comparison here on this graphic. Once we acknowledge that fair doesn't always mean equal, we can start looking at some of the other building blocks of an inclusive mindset. At the base, we have this idea of presumed competence in students with disabilities. Then we'll talk a little bit about least dangerous assumption. And then lastly, we'll talk about high expectations and growth mindset. So first, let's look at the idea of presumed competence. It's easy, so easy, to get caught up in thinking that what we see in a student, so in this graphic here, the trunk, the branches, the leaves, it's easy to think that what we see is the whole tree. But it's important to remember that there's a part of the tree, the roots, that we can't see. In this image, the roots represent the competence that we presume students to have. And it's critical for us to recognize that a student's difficulties with demonstrating knowledge or abilities should not be interpreted as evidence of intellectual incompetence. Just because we can't see direct evidence of competence doesn't mean it doesn't exist. This is especially true when we're thinking about students with significant disabilities, because the simple fact that a student's IQ has been identified as low, or that they have complex physical or communication challenges, doesn't automatically mean that they're incapable. Is it possible that their disability prevents them from doing or knowing something? Absolutely. But do we know that for sure? Absolutely not. It's just too easy to hear these keywords, right? Severe, profound. They're in the 1%. They have a low IQ, whatever it might be. It's so easy to hear those words and assume that we know everything we need to know about that student. You know, they'll need to be in this program, or they're in this classroom with this teacher. They're not going to be able to do X, Y, Z, et cetera, et cetera. But these students are often more capable than we recognize. But it does require effort and creativity and collaboration on our part as educators in order to provide an environment in which these students can demonstrate that. So that's presumed competence in a nutshell. Least dangerous assumption. The next building block is least dangerous assumption. And the easiest way to explain this really is just, it refers to the idea that when we're not sure what a student is capable of, We as educators should make decisions that will ultimately have the least harmful impact on that student's ability to be as independent as possible in the future. Oftentimes we make decisions that make things easier for the student and for ourselves, frankly, in the moment. But in the long run, those can interfere with the ability of that student to function independently. So we have to be able to consider both the short and long-term perspectives. Choosing what's easier for you or the student in the short term could lead to less independence in the future, while hard work now could lead to greater independence for that student down the line. And the easiest way that I've found to illustrate these, the two sides of this coin is by looking at the scenarios here. So here's the first scenario. What if you presume competence in a student with disabilities and give them every opportunity to learn what their same age peers are learning? But one day we find out, maybe through some, magical brain scanning technology or whatever, that the student simply doesn't have the capabilities that we originally presumed. What harm has been done to that student's ability to function? Not so much, right? If we make an assumption that we ultimately find out is not true, if we make an assumption of ability and we ultimately find out that's not true, there's not a lot of harm by making that assumption. We've provided them opportunities, and then perhaps we find out later that it just simply wasn't in them. But on the other hand, if you assume that the presence of a disability, even a significant intellectual disability, means that a student can't learn, you might not give them every opportunity to do so. And then imagine this magical brain scanning technology, comes out again and shows that the student did all along have this greater ability to learn than we first imagined. What harm would have been done if we didn't give them those opportunities to learn? That would significantly, I would say, pretty severely impact that student's ability to function independently. So for us to operate under the least dangerous assumption, we're going to assume that students can learn. We're going to give them every opportunity to do so. And then if they don't, they don't. And it really hasn't had that big of an impact on their ability to function independently. For all of us to be able to operate under that least dangerous assumption, it just means that we have to have high expectations for all students. And we'll talk about high expectations. I think a lot of people cringe at that a little bit, especially thinking about students and with more significant disabilities, but it doesn't mean when we have those high expectations that we are having unreasonable expectations for them, or even the same expectations as, their peers without identified disabilities. Remember, fair isn't always equal, right? So even within this idea of high expectations, we're not necessarily going to have the same high expectations for all students. When we intentionally set high expectations for students, any student, we're making room for them to grow, which is sort of what this red arrow is showing. If we keep our expectations low, we're artificially stunning the growth that these students might have achieved otherwise, right? No one rises to low expectations. So when we have those high expectations, we're making room for them to grow. And that's where that idea of a growth mindset comes in, rather than sort of sticking with an approach that emphasizes a fixed mindset. We can't know for sure what any student is capable of. We can't climb into their minds to see what's really going on in there. But one thing we do know for sure is that students can't learn what they're not taught. So we have to presume that there is some competence and capability in there, present the content to them. Of course, utilizing accommodations, modifications, adapted materials, all these things that we know as special educators are crucial to our students with disabilities. But we're not going to artificially sort of restrict a student's access to that grade level content. We're not going to necessarily have the same approach, the same materials, the same scope and sequence as far as the depth and complexity that we get into. All of that could be different, but as far as the students' access to the content that their non-disabled peers are getting, we really want that to be have equal access there. So, given all of this, what kind of inclusion are we talking about today, right? I sort of talked about the academic pieces a little bit, right, with the content. We touched on the idea of social inclusion and students being able to learn from each other socially in that way. In the past, we sort of patted ourselves on the back when we just put students with disabilities in gen ed classrooms. They were physically there, their body was physically there with their peers without identified disabilities, and then that was inclusion, right? At one point, we considered that inclusion. that's certainly a critical step, to be in the same place as your same age peers, but there are other elements that we have to address too. So that social piece, again, that would include that students need to be included in and supported in non-academic activities with their same age peers. And then lastly, that academic piece, right? That we want them to be exposed to the grade level content. They also need to be supported in it, of course. But this is often where educators can fall back and say, whoa, 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 I was with you until the grade level content piece. Don't you know these students have disabilities and quote unquote can't do what the other kids are doing? That's sort of the point of why we've identified them as having this disability. What's important here again is to work through that difficulty that you have sort of wrapping your head around the idea that that students with disabilities, even students with the most significant disabilities, can participate in, be exposed to grade level academic content. I saw a quick comment floating by, but isn't that frustrating for those students with disabilities? Could it be? 100%. Yes, absolutely. Could it be frustrating for students who are identified as general education students with no disability to learn that content? Yes, 100%, right? So just that mere fact that it could be frustrating, we can't let that be the factor that determines whether or not we provide that access to that student with a disability. The way that we try to reduce that frustration would be through accommodations, modifications, adapted material, all of those kinds of things. So again, this is where we remember fair doesn't necessarily mean equal. Participating in the grade level gen ed content and instruction doesn't have to look the same for every student. In fact, it really shouldn't look the same. What we're focusing on right now is the access to that content. Implementing inclusive practices is certainly a huge part of ensuring that, alongside other ideas like unpacking grade level standards, which we do quite a lot of. Project Success does a lot of professional development in that area, but that's a whole nother training series we could get into. So just know that inclusion isn't the answer for everything, right? We're not saying, well, as soon as you implement inclusive practices, everyone will be good to go. There's a lot of other things that sort of feed into this as well, but we're doing what we can right now by talking about inclusive practices. So thinking back to these three main building blocks of an inclusive mindset, I'd like to hear from you all in the chat box. Which building block do you think will need the most intentional support and resources moving forward, either for yourself as an individual, for your school community? Which one of those areas, sort of that idea that we need to presume competence in students, that idea that regardless of what we know or don't know about a student, we need to provide them the opportunities, that least dangerous assumption? Or then that high expectations piece, that growth mindset, that we need to have high expectations, and that doesn't necessarily mean unreasonable. Seeing a lot of presumed competence, yeah. High expectations, growth mindset, yep. I mean, obviously, these are building blocks for a reason, right? These are all critical pieces of moving forward with a sort of that growth mindset. But presuming competence, I think, is one that a lot of people, it's not because we think badly about students with disabilities. It's just that for so long, that wasn't really how we approached education of students with, especially those with more significant disabilities. We thought we knew what we thought we knew, and we went forward accordingly. But now we're really looking at that there's a lot more to be aware of, I think. And so we need to start from that place of presuming competence. Yeah, I'm seeing some great comments here. All right. I want to follow up. Yeah, presumed competence. So I want to follow up with this last element of inclusive practices. This one is pretty straightforward, and it actually leads us into the next step of our inclusive framework. Step 2, which would be gathering a guiding team, right? To have this teamwork, how are we going to implement these inclusive practices? So I'm going to turn it over to Heidi to start leading the section on gathering a guiding team.
All right, so we are ready for our second step of our framework. That's that gathering guiding teams. So once we've established the need for change and we've expressed that to all parties involved, when we're thinking about the inclusive practice, our next stage would be to gather a group of people who are committed to this journey, to the journey of moving forward with inclusive practices. Whether you've already started that journey in your school or whether it's just beginning, your team could look different. It could be maybe expanding the team you currently have, or it could be starting from scratch and gathering that team. We know that some people are on this call today that are participating individually. So when you're thinking about building an effective team, think about it through maybe what you want to do in your classroom, or what would be your vision for your school and how you might begin to share that. So some key ways to building an effective team are to really think about that makeup. Think about who should be on that team. Think about what the individuals do that represent each role on the team, maybe what skills they represent, what their different perspectives are. It could be that you might have some special education teachers on there, some general education teachers, administrators, related service personnel, paraprofessionals, maybe even some parents. You also want to consider that you have a well-rounded team so that you have different grade levels, different departments, people with different specialty areas, different content experts. Each of these roles really provides a different perspective and kind of a different lens to look through. And so it's important to really have a team that has many different viewpoints and many different perspectives. Another thing to really think about when you're thinking about building an effective team is that it really should be voluntary. We know that having the mindset of inclusive practice is important. Ashley just talked a lot about it, that mindset, and it's critical. So people who feel like they're being made to participate might not agree, and it might create a barrier. It might really create a stumbling block for schools to get inclusive practices started. Of course, with any professionals, it's helpful to make sure that you have they have effective interpersonal skills. It's also very important when you're thinking about building a team to establish team norms. What's okay during a meeting, what's okay when you're talking with team members. Also about being intentional about communication. When is it going to take place? How often are we going to meet? Are we going to communicate by email? Are we going to communicate only at meetings? Set that stage ahead of time so that your team can be effective. Setting those things up with intentionality is very helpful.
Okay, wait. Put the clothes on first.
Okay, so we are now going to move on to the template we've created for building an inclusive team. Remember the icon on the bottom right, it lets you know that inside your engagement guide, there is this link to this, as well as on the resource page on our website, you can download this. We've developed this to help you think about some guiding questions, some considerations when who to get involved in your inclusive teams. So some of the questions we would think that you might want to ask would be, who knows the student best? And don't leave people out in that category, because there are a lot of people in the schools that sometimes we don't even try to gain access from. It could be the cafeteria lady that might know that student best. It could be a custodian who that student talks to a lot. It could be one of the front office staff. It might be another volunteer who comes regularly to the school. So really, when you think about who knows that student's best, look outside the box and think about key people who you would not necessarily add to the team. Paraprofessionals are a great resource as well. Then think about who knows the academic content best. This really needs to be you really need to think not just the special education teacher and then gen ed teacher. You want to think about maybe a curriculum coach, an instructional coach, maybe the curriculum director. It could be any of those people that really know the content and know academically at each grade level what is necessary in that curriculum. Who has the ability to influence building schedules and procedures? Typically, this would be the building administrator or system principal, counselors who create the schedules. So think about those people. They should be on the team to help you build that inclusive practice for scheduling. Who has the ability to influence schools' culture? Is it the principal? Is it the assistant principal? Is it who are the people that really help mold that school culture? They need to be on board. Who has the expertise, expert knowledge in areas that would make education more accessible, especially with students with significant intellectual disabilities? That could be your AT specialist, that could be your SLPs, your OTs, your PTs. It could be that paraprofessional again, somebody who's spent a lot of time with that student as a one-on-one. Coaches, who is already championing the idea of inclusive practice. We always want champions to be on the team. They're the ones that are going to help spread the word, and they're going to be the ones that get people on board. And then last, who is still resisting inclusive practice and could offer good insight about potential roadblocks, the barriers? Sometimes it's important to have somebody on the team like that because we need to know what those barriers would be and kind of be able to be proactive about that and kind of work through those. I would agree. And the chat box is talking a lot about para educators. We know that oftentimes their schedules don't allow for after school meetings or before meetings. Maybe sometimes you could have something during the day if you could schedule something, or maybe you could have some questionnaires or some surveys just to make sure that you're getting their feedback because it's valuable information. All right. So moving on to our next two steps in our framework, creating the vision and sharing that vision. So once you've gathered your team together, it is important to think about your very first task. And that very first task would be to create the vision of what your inclusive practice will look like, either in your school, your classroom, or your district. Like I talked to you about just a little bit ago, if you're the individual participant today and you're not with a team, think about it for your classroom and think about how you'd like to see it in your classroom, and then express throughout your school. Throughout our series, we will be really talking about this, and you could add that piece on to bring team members along the way as you work through this for the next couple of weeks. All right, what is a vision statement? So the first agenda for your inclusive vision would be to be thinking about some key things. A statement of your current and future objectives related to the implementation of the inclusive practices. What do you want to accomplish? What do you want it to look like? A guide to help you make decisions that align with your goal of increasing inclusive practice. What do you want to accomplish? Make sure that is something that is accomplishable, is able to be accomplished in a timely manner. And a roadmap to where you want to be in the implementation within a certain time frame. That time frame is important. You want to set goals for within your vision statement so that it can happen and you can measure that when it's happening. So when you're starting to this part, because we're working through the template and giving you some pre-activities, it's important to think about, are you guys going to meet as a team and think about a team vision statement, or is this going to be an individual vision statement for you within your classroom? So be starting to think about that. So what's the point? Some of you are thinking, I didn't sign up for this series to be writing a vision statement. But I want you to know that I want to know that helping students starts with that vision statement. You have to know where you're going. You have to know how to implement changes in your classroom, in your school, in your school district, and that starts by really having a vision, seeing the big picture. It's easy to get bogged down in the day-to-day details of what you're trying to do. So this vision statement kind of guides you on your journey. It helps you plan long-term. It helps you not lose sight of the goals that you're working towards. It kind of, if you're working as a team, it gives you a common goal. It helps you agree on the destination. If everyone is left to make kind of their own devices and creating their own vision, it would kind of be chaotic, and people would kind of do it as a well, let's just check and see, and we'll see how it goes. Whereas if it's a joint decision and you have a path to go, things would be, you'll be being proactive, and you'll be looking through and kind of aligning to your mindset and aligning to the stages of the framework. So when we think about what are the best practices for writing a vision statement, we think about a couple of things. One, it needs to be clear and concise. This is not the time that we want to use long, wordy statements or beliefs. We need to make it challenging, but it has to be achievable. So it should involve like stretching to reach towards a goal. But it does no good to create a vision statement that's not achievable, that it's impossible to achieve. And we need to think about a vision statement is kind of a living document. It can be revised, it can be changed. So think about it that it might be changed, because as you're starting out, it might look one way, but as you continue on your journey, you might have to revise that vision statement. It definitely needs to be future oriented and then time bound. It should be defined to a certain time, specific goals. Otherwise, if you just kind of don't have any time frame on it, there's no sense of urgency. There's no reason to change. There's no action that needs to be reached by a certain time. The last one is to make it visible. Post it around the school, include it in your email signature, include it on sticky notes around where you might sit, your computer. Make it a part of your everyday surroundings. This is the best way that you can share that vision. And the key is sharing that vision so everybody has the same vision, so everybody's working towards that same goal. All right. So once again, we're referring to the engagement guide, or if what you've downloaded from the website. We have created a template, an inclusive vision template. It really has encompassed all the things we've been talking about. Through asking some considerations, some of those things that Ashley spoke to in the meat and the content of our establishing that need for change. It walks you through the initial stages of the inclusive framework. It really wants you to reflect on that need for change, what's currently happening in your school, who's already involved, where you'd like to go, where you'd like to be, whether that's your classroom, your school, your district. We will be using this template for the future. This is part of your pre-activity for our next session. We would encourage you to be thinking about these questions and be thinking about that vision. Like I said, if you are working as a team, great. We want you to get together and talk about this vision statement and kind of work on it together. If you're working individually during this series, you can do that for your classroom. There will be a link later to you to submit some of the work that you're working on through your vision statement. So let's take a look at some of these examples. We have two vision statement examples. Let's take a look at these. I'll give you a minute to read through it. So let's think through this best practice of writing a vision statement. Is it clear and concise? This one, this Creekland Middle School? I would say yes and no. This, it lists a statement for each group of stakeholders. That's clear. But the statements are pretty broad. They don't give any specific roles and things to accomplish. And you're right, in the chat box, too long, it's vague about time. Yep. Is it challenging but achievable? Yes, it's challenging, right? But is it achievable? Can you become a world-class school? And how long is it going to take to become a world-class school, right? Achieving excellence in all areas, that's a pretty lofty goal. Is it future-oriented or time-bound? They use the word will, but nothing states about when the vision statement will be achieved. What are some things you think could make it better? Some achievable goals, yep, clear, as you were stating in the chat box. What are some other things that could make this a better vision statement? When it will be achieved by, yes. Setting that time bound parameter. Being specific, yep. Take will out. When was, yep. What is it? What does achieving excellence specifically mean? Right. Putting a time frame. Good. Thank you. Let's look at another one. I'll give you a moment to read this one. And this one's a little long as well. Okay, is this clear and concise? It's more specific. Yep, it's clear. Give it a time frame. Yes. It does read like a constitution, I would agree. It's specific about what they're going to provide, right? Yes. Yep, it's future oriented. Yep. College and career readiness is a clear goal. Got a lot of stakeholders in it. Great. So when you're thinking about writing your vision statement, I would encourage you to go back and look at these two examples and what we've discussed when you're thinking about it for your school. Thank you for sharing on that. Our next slide is a quote about what I want you to think about. Ashley, there. Oops, Ashley's having technical difficulties there. Our next slide is a quote about from the American Journal on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. It states, in order to comply with the legal mandates of LRE, IEP teams should treat the general education classroom as a default educational placement. I'd like for you to think about how this quote might be something that influences your own vision statement. Think about how you can apply this quote to your vision statement for your school. The general education classroom as a default educational placement. I think that will help you shape your vision for your school. So now we'd like you to take some time in your engagement guide or a piece of paper if you weren't able to print that up and jot down a few words or phrases that describes your vision for the inclusion in your school or your district. If you want to share it out, please. We'll give you a few moments to do that. Inclusion is reflective of how any one of us would want to be included in any given scenario. I agree, Tracy. Others, what comes to mind? What are a few words or phrases when you're thinking about what you would like to include in a vision statement for your school or classroom? A cohesive effort with all aspects. More collaboration, teamwork. All students are valued, have a sense of belonging. Cohesiveness. Equal opportunities. More collaboration with general education teachers. Supportive, successful, diversity, community engagement. Meaningful and purposeful activities. Those are great starts to phrases that could be formed into effective vision statements that would make a difference. We are one in this classroom. Empathy, equality. Safe place. Right. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. And I hope that you will think about these when, like I talked about in your next pre-activities, we will be giving you some opportunities to work on that vision statement. So I think Ashley's going to jump on now, and we are going to wrap up for our series 1 and give you some next steps.
Yeah, so we're nearing the end of our time together in this first session. And so I wanted to take a quick look back at where we've been and then review where we'll be going next. So today we reviewed the steps of the inclusive framework that you see highlighted at the top, establishing a need for change, gathering a guiding team, and then creating and sharing your vision. Where we're going in our next session, we'll be spending a lot of time on the take action stage of the framework. And then in our last session, we'll be covering the remaining stages of securing small wins, reflecting, analyzing, and adjusting, and then setting the norm. This is an overview of what session 2 will look like. Specifically, we'll take a look at what it means to take action by assessing current inclusive practices, reviewing some inclusive strategies that you might consider implementing in the future, and then finally in that session, creating an action plan for moving forward. As far as pre-activities go, to complete prior to session 2, as soon as you're able, if you could please complete the session 1 exit ticket, that's going to give us valuable feedback for what we can add or change to make our remaining sessions as beneficial as possible to you. You can access the exit ticket either on the Summer Institute page of our website, which we showed you at the beginning and we'll show you here again in just a second. There's also a link within your engagement guide where you can access the exit ticket or by clicking the link directly in this slide. Then prior to our next session, you'll also want to complete the other pre-activities listed here. You're going to use the template that we reviewed earlier to draft your own vision statement, either with the team you signed up with or as an individual, and submit that finished statement on the Summer Institute page of our website using the link in our engagement guide or by clicking the link on this slide. So you'll see there's a line there, submit your inclusive vision statement here. That's where you can go to see your vision statement prior to our next session. There's also going to be an opportunity for you to preview some of our session 2 content by checking out a couple things here. There's an article, about making inclusion a reality for students with severe disabilities, and then a quick sort of visual blog post from the Inclusion Lab that also is going to give you a good way to preview a lot of the things that we'll be talking about next week. We wanted to make sure that we were upfront about the amount of time that it may be taking you to complete these pre-activities, knowing that you'll be getting professional growth points for the completion of everything. We want to make sure you can budget your time accordingly. So that's just an estimate of time that it will take to complete those pre-activities. The link for the exit I see is also in the chat box as well. So hopefully you can find it in a variety of places. And of course, if not, feel free to email us. One more time. There we go. I wanted to make sure before we close out here today that you know the website, www.projectsuccessindiana.com. That's where you'll be able to access all the resources from today's session by clicking on that resources tab in the upper right-hand corner, and then again selecting Summer Institute 2020 from the regional trainings drop-down menu and clicking go. I know that there have been a couple instances of links either not working, being broken, somehow not updating. We're going to go through and make sure all those links have been updated in as many places as possible to make sure that you all have access to each thing that we discussed today. If you continue to have difficulty accessing anything, please feel free to email me. We'll stay on here for a few more minutes in case anyone has questions or comments that they want to add. Between now and our next session, if you have, like I said, any questions either with the just accessing the materials or content-wise, you want to know our opinion on something, whatever it might be, questions that you have, please feel free to email me, Ashley, at aquick@pcgus.com or Heidi at hbrettbaker@pcgus.com. Like I said, we'll stay on here for a few more minutes if anyone has questions or comments that they want to add. Otherwise, we look forward to joining you again next Tuesday for our second session. Thank you so much.
And just a reminder, if we're not able to complete the pre-activities for session 1, those are on the website or in the beginning of this slide presentation. All those links are in there so you can go back and do that. I would really encourage you, if you've not done the self-assessment, to go back and do that. It would be a great piece of information for you. Thanks everybody for joining and chatting with us today and being engaged in the series.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Rolanda Johnson. I want to ask a question about your self-assessment. Is there any kind of way you'll know when we're done with the self-assessment? Do we have to turn that in also?
No, that's for you. That's for you for your reflection.
Question. Hello?
Yes.
I just wrote it. Will we use the same link next week or will we get something new?
Mary, I believe it will be a new link sent out this week, correct?
Okay, and on mine,
Everyone should have received a calendar appointment for next week's session if you signed up for all 3. But if not, we can go in and check. I'm sorry, what's your name?
Phillips.
Phillips. Okay, I'll make sure that that we resend that to you today.
Okay, Phillips.
We'll make sure in the follow-up email that we send out after this session, we're going to send out all the pre-activities again. Any questions that needed to be answered, things like that. We'll make sure to include that updated or the correct sign-in link as well in that email. So it'll go out to everyone.
Okay, and I may be on there twice. I started off on my phone because I was having problems joining, so I may be counted twice, but I came. Okay, I just wanted to make sure you knew.
Sure, thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Great.
Thank you. We're so glad you could be with us.
Oh, thank you. I look forward to next week.
Thank you for those that are sharing in the chat box about receiving the link. We will make sure that we will get those to you.
Hello, ladies. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Quick question. I've been following along with the paper copy of the Inclusive Practices Framework. So next week, we will begin Take Action will be school leaders can empower educators to take action by being aware of, etc. Correct? I just wanted to make sure I was making little notes on the side that I was in the right location.
Yes, we'll focus primarily on that Take Action section of the framework. Yep.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much. It was excellent. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much.
Thank you.
Have a blessed day.
Thank you, you
All
too.
right, you too.
And the only other question on the exit ticket and the vision statement, you said that we'll see that on, you'll send something or we'll see that as far as, because that has to be done before next week, right?
Right. So you can access those things a few different ways. You can get it on our website, on the Summer Institute page where I showed you that drop down.
Okay.
Everything should be listed there sort of by session. You'll see the exit ticket and all the different templates and documents that you need.
Okay.
It'll also come in an email to you.
Okay, good. Okay. Thank you. You've been thorough.
Thank you.
Ashley,
Yes.
this is Julie from Northern Indiana and Angola.
Hey, Julie.
Oh. Hey, we have a quick question. If we're doing everything together, do you want us to submit double vision statement and that kind of stuff?
Great question. You can just send in one for the group.
Okay, perfect.
Whoever's with you. Yep,
Thank you.
you bet.